Welcome to Conversations with the USA Racewalking Foundation.
Okay. All right, we're going to get started. We're here with another talk in the series from USA Racewalking Foundation, and we're lucky tonight to have Luke DePron, who was really the brainchild behind all the strength training stuff that I've promoted for the last 3 or 4 years. I am a racewalking expert. I am not a strength training expert. And when it came time to update all my racewalking stuff, I didn't even attempt to create a program. I went to the person who I knew was training the best people in America and arguably in Canada at the time, which was Luke DePron. Was working with both Rachel Seaman and Miranda Melville, and had developed their strength training program. I thought what he had developed was really good and comprehensive and very, very different from what I had been taught back in the 80s. And any of us, and most of us in race walking are on the elder side of the spectrum, need to realize that what we were taught in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even 2000s may not be what is best for race walkers today. Luke, you've got a very interesting background, and as you said to me before we started, race walking really isn't your focus. So a lot of people will find this on the internet and they won't be race walkers. So why don't you start just by introducing yourself, kind of your credentials, and what it is. I think you have kind of a unique outlook of what you are teaching people in terms of strength training. And then we can kind of focus back into race walking specific or walking specific strength training concepts.
Sure. Yeah. And I'll try to make this full circle to that. So, fortunately, I've been able to do kind of anything and everything in the fitness industry. I came into this with an exercise science degree from Illinois State University, was doing personal training, and actually ended up compressing a disc in my back, which led to crawling literally into a rehab studio here in San Diego, which over time I eventually ended up working there as a corrective exercise specialist, kind of cutting my teeth, working under some DCs and some PTEs there. And eventually that led to working with a lot of athletes, some of the race walking people and folks from that area. And then eventually started my own practice, was doing a lot of corrective exercise on my own. And all the way to today, where now I do more of like a holistic online side. I work with entrepreneurs and we handle the nutrition, we handle the exercise, kind of the lifestyle habits, and bring frameworks of accountability. So it's more on the weight loss focused, which if you're trying to go down that path, there is a absolute big component of strength training. So as far as the strength training side, regardless of really application, whether you're going to be a race walker, you're looking to lose weight, whatever it is, there's going to be some foundational pieces. And that's ultimately, I think, where kind of our intersection happened, was bringing some more foundational strength training components to some of the endurance athletes, as that was kind of one of the missing pieces for them.
Excellent. So if I go in the Wayback Machine, and I started my athletic career in 1984, so that
was my birth year.
Thanks for that. Right? I'm a true 80s child. The first kind of stigma to overcome was that strength training was good for race walkers and endurance athletes. And so we would preach, no, it's okay to strength train, but you got to do it right. And right in my day was 3 sets of 10, lower weights, more reps. I even said, I'll build up to 15 before I increase the weight. And that to me was the Bible in the 80s. And everything was either machine driven, where I'm doing a straight bench on a machine because I don't have a partner, or dumbbell. I still like dumbbells, but it was I'm going to work my bicep, I'm going to work my tricep, I'm going to work my hamstring. There was no totality of functional motion. It was just strengthen the exercises. And I'm not saying that was right. It's certainly not right today. I'm not even saying it was right then, but that's what I had been taught. That's what I had learned. And I was a muscular but trim race walker who I felt had upper body and lower body strength and good hip rotation. So it had worked for me, but obviously there are better things. So the first question I have for you is, what was wrong with what I was doing? And what are misconceptions today of strength training in general? Because my belief is everybody should strength train all the way up into your 80s and 90s because you don't want to lose muscle mass. But
Absolutely.
a lot of people don't for a lot of reasons. And I've seen a lot of your posts encouraging people to be active and exercise and combat the excuses
Yeah.
that people come up with.
Sure.
And one of the excuses is I shouldn't do it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously a lot there. To me, strength training really is going to be a foundational piece of kind of all athletics, because if you think of strength within certain movement patterns is really going to give you is more like a foundational piece or a foundational principle. So, like how do we literally just drive and create force? And, when you think of aging, when you see somebody who is 80, 90, and when we think of somebody who is quote old, it's really a lack of mobility and it's a lack of strength that we're seeing. So like, yes, we do recognize age and atrophy has happened, right? And like the frail old man or the frail old woman. And so like, yes, that is absolutely a loss of skeletal tissue. I mean, sarcopenia is happening. So like we do want it for that aspect. As far as from like a performance standpoint, looking back at what you were doing, it's not that I wouldn't say it's wrong, right? Like you're still going to be strengthening muscles in that fashion, but is it efficient and is it optimal? And so in that sense, breaking up your muscle groups into these small segmented approaches, it's again, an inefficient path. As an athlete of really any sport, you're really looking to maybe tether the body into a more of a whole unit. Doesn't mean that there isn't like some role for ancillary types of exercises to target smaller muscle groups. But in general, if we can think of tethering the system into more of like a holistic unit, so an exercise like say like a split squat, where that's going to drive action at the hip and the knee, but it's also going to challenge stability at the ankle. And now if we were to load it with say dumbbells, we even get some bicep and delt engagement, and we can really kind of bring things together versus that segmented approach that you're probably doing back in the 80s. And then additionally, I would say like loads and that idea of endurance, particularly with endurance athletes. It's not like you're going to need to go in and do the 3 sets of 15 or 20 because with lightweight, because I'm an endurance athlete and I need to create endurance in the weight room. That there's not going to be a big crossover of creating like muscular endurance through the weight room that's going to translate over to mile 17, right?
Sure.
I think of it as more trying to use strength as creating a bigger motor to then go and apply to the race. I don't know if that analogy really hits home. So those strength loads
that's
are
exactly the analogy that Tim uses when we talk about training, just the pure race walking side, is you want to build a bigger engine.
Yeah. And because it's like, are you going to go get faster by just doing the thing? And it's like, most likely not, right? Like there's obviously gonna be like technique that you guys are working on. You're going to see massive improvements, but simply just doing more running may not improve your ability at some point, right? If you're a novice, of course it will, but at some point, just running more is going to have a diminishing return on that investment. So we need to like come in with other tools. And again, bringing a bigger motor, a bigger strength platform to any of that, I think is going to be supportive and useful, all the way down to, I think, supporting like good structure in those mechanics, like all the way down to like the ankle and the foot. And so like you can use good strength training to like create demand in those like targeted areas and tissues.
So, when I first contacted you years ago and I watched what you were doing with the athletes, it was like night and day from what I was doing, right? All of a sudden you're doing these heavy, heavy reps. And I think the very important thing we have to tell everyone who's watching is, while you could do what I was prescribing in your house without a lot of supervision, what we're prescribing today based on your philosophy, you really want a personal trainer to watch you and make sure that you're doing it correct. And even the elite athletes continue to come and see you to make sure that as they were increasing weight, they didn't start favoring something and doing it the wrong way. Because if people do these exercises and lift a lot of weight but use the wrong muscles, it's counterproductive.
Yeah. And there's, I think, going to be some things that are contraindicated that even today, compared to with some, depending on the athlete, I would maybe pull like, something like a back squat can be, I think, a productive overall global strength exercise. Again, how much does that translate to say like walking or running performance. I mean, that would be up for debate because it's not like a unilateral single leg movement. And there's obviously going to be a higher risk there. And there are going to be certain populations, and I even think in the athletic space where like that's contraindicated. One thing that was unique with the race walk population is somebody who doesn't come from that space, right? Like at all. There are some, I would almost say like biomechanical changes or postural changes that happen because that gait is so unique. Right. And so like, as an example, the athletes that you mentioned, like both actually struggled with like a single leg RDL. Now it didn't make that exercise.
What is RDL?
So an RDL is just like a Roman deadlift. So it's a single leg hip hinge exercise. Well, there's a level of corrective exercise that can be done to help make that exercise to be done better. But also there's just little modifications where it's like with those athletes, like we used a handrail often, and it wasn't like a death grip hold on the rail, but just a little like access to that to help them create a little bit more pelvic stability and still be able to create like force generation. Other athletes, if they didn't have all the stimulus of all of the mileage with that gait, we probably would be able to make a correction from that and not need that. And so I do think you have to kind of respect the personal or sport specific kind of ramifications. Like here's a far easier visual one to picture. If you were to take an Olympic gymnast, and it's like, you absolutely could say like, hey, he's got forward shoulders. And it's like, there's no need, or I would have no business trying to make that correction because that posture is actually supportive to what they're doing. And I think with some of the race walk stuff, again, there's some change that's going to happen with that gait, and particularly the mileage that you guys are doing with it.
So it's funny. I recently started walking for myself again, and nice. I just started power walking instead of race walking because my knee was irritated from an elliptical, doing too much elliptical in the winter, right? And I saw I'm rotating my hips like a race walker. And then, so what is power walking, right? And if you research it, everyone's got a different definition. And one definition I found said, don't have an exaggerated hip rotation. And I'm like, okay. You're right, because they're trying to differentiate it from race walking. But,
sure,
well, what is exaggerated, right? That's a completely nebulous definition, right? But race walkers have a very unique gait, which is why the race walkers were doing certain exercises. Just for everybody's knowledge, at the end of this video, when it's recorded, I will put a link to a playlist with all of the videos of the exercises that we're talking about. So I think we had a total of 14 that we recorded back in the day. They're all on YouTube now, and I'll just link the playlist when we're done. So people don't have to be like, well, what's he talking about? So if you abbreviate something, I'll ask you to
gotcha. Yeah.
Say it all the way out. But people don't have to question it. They can go right to a Luke video that we already have recorded and see the right way to do it. But I think you've driven home my point, which is that regardless of how long you've been strength training, if you're going to pick up on this, then you do want a strength trainer to evaluate you personally, find out what your weaknesses are, right? And interpret, say, hey, here are the 14 exercises that were recommended for race walking. Which of these should I do? Which of these should I avoid because I may have some issue? And then help me do them. And someone just commented on my comment, I think, about abbreviating. So I think we're talking at too high of a level for beginners, right? So if you use terms, if you can explain them as you use them, I think that will be helpful for many.
Got it. Okay. Yep.
Let me just check that comment while we're see if I got that right. Okay, so what they were basically saying is, can you simplify a bit more the difference from regular strength training to what folks should be doing? So I think, and they don't even know what the new method is. So why don't we back up and talk? I guess I presumed also that people might have watched the stuff I've already put on. So when you say full functional workout, focusing, why don't you explain a little bit of what that is?
Yeah. So like for me, we could bring it down, particularly like if we are talking for beginners, and to where strength training is not going to be your full focus. It's stripping it down to like basic movement patterns. And so like things like split squats or, like a lunge, like while it can be a very basic exercise, like that's an extremely dynamic exercise when done well and when brought into like a good program, because it's going to target a lot of different muscles at one time. And specifically like for like the walking community, it's going to act on the ankle, the knee, and the hip all at once, rather than say somebody who goes to the gym, they sit down on like the leg extension machine and they kick their leg out to work their quad in this like really isolated fashion. And then they go to another machine and they turn over the other way and they work their hamstring in a really isolated fashion. That's not going to have as much carryover to like a performance standpoint because you've isolated those muscle groups. So if we can begin to bring those together and choose exercises that are basically tethered to where, again, like say something like a lunge or a split squat, man, you get to act on a multitude of muscles at once that are also going to have a much more relevance to like natural gait, if that makes sense.
So Noel just asked a question. So less machine strength workouts. And I don't know if that is 100% true, because some of the exercises that we show use machines, right? But it's not an isolated machine exercise. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. And I mean, if I were to really like, you could do a lot of good with just a good set of dumbbells. So like for somebody who is thinking like, man, do I got to get a gym membership to do all this stuff? And it's like, no, if you got a good set of dumbbells, you'd be able to create some good, I was going to say good damage, some good progress, just even with dumbbells. And again, exercises like single leg Romanian deadlifts, which are just like a basic hip hinge exercise, split squats, step ups. Again, these are all single leg exercises that like you don't need a machine for. And this kind of goes across, my philosophy for strength training kind of transcends beyond race walkers. If you were just somebody who said like, hey, I want to be able to hike and I want to be able to be strong, these are the same type of exercises and movements because there is more real world application. And exercise as a step up, well, like you can imagine when you hike, you're doing that very similar pattern of movement that you would be doing if you were doing a step up exercise. That makes sense?
Yeah. And we kind of jumped ahead of ourselves. I'm going to use Noel's excuse for reeling it back a little bit. Let's just talk about the benefits of strength training in general, right? So in my opinion, what I've always said is, first of all, we lose muscle mass as we age. So we want to try to slow that progression down. But for people who are just trying to lose weight, that if you add muscle, you increase your metabolism and you'll be burning more calories all day, right? Is that still a fair adage, or?
Yeah, it's not much. So the idea, like your muscle fiber is obviously metabolically active, but so is fat mass. So most people actually, if you were a 250-pound man and you became 200 pounds, you'd probably have a lower BMR. Your basal metabolic rate would actually be lower. So the value from a calorie standpoint, though, would be when you have more muscle mass, when you go to do your workouts, you now have, again, a bigger motor that you're bringing to the playground. And that is going to require more energy. You're going to be able to do more work. So you're going to have a higher capacity, which would then burn more calories.
Okay.
But the calorie burn per pound of muscle that you were to put on, man, for it to be like consequential, if you put on like 50 pounds of muscle, which would not be beneficial, by the way, to any race walker, it's like 4 calories a pound or something. And it's like, well, that's like 2 tablespoons of butter and you just negated all of that.
Right.
So the calorie day to day and the BMR, not so much, but on the calorie gain from, I think, intense workouts is there. As far as just like the lifeblood of movement, though, really does come from strength. And again, this is what we spoke about, the elderly person. When someone struggles to get up off of the chair, yeah, there's a mobility issue often, but it's, at the end of the day, it's a lack of strength. So sarcopenia, this natural breakdown of muscle, if you're not really targeting it with direct, I think, resistance training, after the age of 30, I think it's like a 10% reduction per year. And, there's just not a lot of, big muscular old people right? That is the natural aging
Right.
process. So you do want to kind of stave that off as long as possible because it's going to give you more capacity for movement. So extrapolate the old person who's struggling to get out of the chair versus the person who's kept their muscle mass up higher longer and kept movement up. And now that's the person that you meet on the hiking trail who's 80, which, you know, you pointed out that I was at Arches National Park and we did a sunrise hike, and here comes an 80-year-old, 80 or probably 85-year-old couple for the sunrise hike. And it's like they aged very differently because they still had strength.
This is why I drive a little two-seater convertible that's very low to the ground, that getting out of the car is exercise.
There you go.
And since my father-in-law doesn't watch these videos, I'm just going to call him out and say that he struggled getting out of my car. But my 94-year-old athlete, Jack Starr, had no problem getting in and out of it.
Yeah.
He's still active at 94.
And I love it. And so to me, that's probably one of the biggest values of bringing a strength component, particularly again, some of the exercises that you'll see that I do think are very basic, but can be scaled and be done very dynamically. There is a big crossover to, again, I think just general life, right? Like I keep mentioning a split squat or a lunge, but it's like you pretty much do that every time you get up off of the floor. Everybody kind of gets into this one-legged kneeled stance and goes and pushes up off the ground. And it's like, can you create enough force to get yourself up? Oftentimes, if you don't have enough strength, you're then going to go into dysfunctional patterns that start to put you at risk for, I think, soft tissue stuff. So again, a great example, and for anybody who can't picture it, a split squat, just picture you're literally taking a knee, like you're doing like the baseball photo when you were a kid. And for the person who doesn't have strength in that position, you'll often see the arch collapse, their knee will drive in, and that's putting some rotational forces on the knee. So the meniscus is kind of in a compromised position. And that happens from a lack of glute strength, the ability to hold their arch in the right position. And some of that lack of strength will create degradation down the chain because you can't hold those positions. And so there's, again, carryover, I think, across the board for a lot of like those basic movements.
I have a friend who's 10 years younger than me, and I always joke that he's 10 years older. And I was on his kitchen floor, and I can't remember if it was with my dog or his kid, but like I literally just stood up vertically, didn't need to, use my hands or whatever. And he was like, "How do you do that?" And I'm like, "It's called being a race walker, dude." Like,
yeah,
being active, being out there. Let's pivot for a second, and they could watch the videos. They can see the right way to do these kind of exercises. For a race walker who's going to be doing hard workouts during the week, when is a good time for them to strength train? How much should they strength train?
Yeah. And so this will obviously be like season dependent. And one thing, let's put a little preface here for people. If you're a competitive athlete, and again, you have the term athlete, you're going to have I think a different ability to integrate some of these exercises versus maybe somebody who's listening to this, who's a more recreational hiker, walker, that person. For that athlete, the goal is to build strength and power without actually hypertrophying the cell. So let's say you're
Can you explain hypertrophy?
Yeah, we don't want to actually increase cell size. We don't want to be bigger. We don't want to be a bodybuilder, right? So if you're a 150-pound race walker at 5'9", it probably would not serve you to show up as a 175-pound race walker. You putting on 25 pounds of muscle, and you now come up to the race, that probably actually isn't going to serve you. So for that person, to make sure that doesn't happen, you do want to think about how you're bringing in the loads. And this is where, yes, we would scale those weights up and bring those reps down into like the 2 to 5 rep range, because we're not going to hypertrophy the cell. You're going to get stronger. You're going to be able to have more force production, but you're not going to get more, quote, like bigger. And like the way you can also think about this is, imagine a fighter or a boxer, like they have a strict weight limit, right? So if a fighter has to make a fight at 170 pounds, he still wants to become more strong and more powerful, but he can't get bigger. Whereas take somebody like me, who was a scrawny little twerp his whole life and kind of wanted to get bigger. I actually tried to make the cell get bigger, and I actually put on, say, 20 or put on like 30 pounds. Well, that wouldn't be really useful, right?
Right.
In that, if I was actually a 170-pound race walker. So for those folks, those weights are going to go up into like, and we're going to stay in that 2 to 5 range. But if you're somebody else who is maybe in the older population and maybe you're not as competitive, there's obviously a higher risk when you're using a weight that you can actually only do 2 times, right? Like a 2 RIR is a 2 reps in reserve, meaning, or I'm sorry, an RIR is reps in reserve. If you did a weight that you can only do 2 times and there's only like 1 more in the tank, maybe that's a higher risk movement. So for somebody who's maybe just a more recreational athlete, or if you're older, there's still going to be great value in strength training, but maybe you stay in that 10 to 15 range. You're still going to build strength. And the reality is, particularly if you're older, you're not going to hypertrophy those cells anyway. You're not going to put on a ton of muscle. It's like just not going to happen, unfortunately, for you. So that is one, I think, important distinction to make, that if you're a rec person and you're older, if you were to hop into some of these exercises and try to hit them to where you're doing sets that you can only do 2 to 3 reps, there's a much higher risk of injury there.
Okay, so this actually brings me to a question I was going to end with, but not everybody listening can afford a personal trainer. So if we want to make what you are teaching safer, I think you just hit one right on the head, which is don't max out because you run too great of a risk of getting injured unless you're supervised and someone's watching. And the knee going to the side is literally one of the ones we show in one of the videos where I think Rachel or Miranda, intentionally was doing it wrong,
sure.
right? And slid out, right? And so for the vast majority of people who can't afford one-on-one coaching, then it's far safer to increase the reps, decrease the weight. And, again, that was the way I trained. I never hulked out, right? I was 6'2" and 159 pounds. And Mike Roll, I was 4.3% body fat measured by Mike Roll in the
Holy cow, that's crazy.
Right? And that was eating Haagen-Dazs, right? I was a metabolism machine back then.
That's one value of hitting the pavement, that's for sure.
And my career ended before I was out of college, so I never got to like 130, 140 kilometer weeks. I was probably hovering around 100 at max. So I didn't even put the massive miles.
But you can still, you're going through some calories at that point.
Yeah.
So that's funny. So for somebody, again, beginning, you have to understand, like, these are, if this is a novel exercise, like, novelty is going to create its own intensity. So like, I like to consider myself an athlete. I do jujitsu, which is extremely hard. But if I were to come out and join any one of you for any endurance activity, I would get my butt absolutely kicked. So it is about scaling things back from the start. And then it's just using progressive overload. So, I, as an example of that, I had a kid who recently, he's my age, he's on, an exercise. He's using he started with 10 pounds in each hand on that split squat, and he couldn't believe that he could barely do that. And it was kicking his butt. But in just 3 months, now he's progressed up to where he is holding 65 pounds in each hand. So it's really more about that progression over time and continuously challenging the system. So don't think that it's this race to figure out how high you can go, because there's value in building that strength along the way. So for somebody who is thinking like, oh man, I got to start lower and use some higher, like that's perfectly fine. There's going to be a ton of value you can soak from those zones, if you will.
And you've got to get that technique down correctly, because if you rush it, and race walking is one of these sports that's rare that you can do it the rest of your life, right? So if you rush, you're going to get injured. And if you get injured, you're not going to progress, and you're going to not have that consistency of training that you want. So take your time, build it slowly. Don't wake up the morning after your first strength training exercise and you can't lift the spoon to have breakfast, right?
Yeah. Here's a concept that I always share, and I don't know, for some people it probably lands, for other people, I don't know, hopefully it doesn't make confusion, but I think it's very important to understand that your body is always going to look for the path of least resistance. And so it's almost easier to do an exercise wrong than it is right. And if you flip in your mind what you're thinking about doing during strength training, it's not about how many reps you can do. It's trying to figure out how to make that weight feel harder so you can do fewer. And your body, again, with this path of least resistance, it's going to find what I call energy leaks. And here's a really good visual for this. Everybody's done a plank at some point, probably. And if you were in a boot camp class where they're like, all right, hold the plank, at the end, everybody's doing one of two things. Their butt is either shot up in the air or their hips have sagged way down. And the reason is because that takes less muscle to support that positioning and allow you to, quote, do the movement. But the work was actually, can you maintain that position? And so it's the same thing when you're strength training. The work is, hey, can you maintain that good solid arch? Can you maintain your pelvis in a neutral position? Can you stop your knee from driving in? That's the work. And you'll smoke out that exercise far sooner if you focus on, again, using, quote, good form. And you can play with this because all of a sudden when you get fatigued, you could change positions and might be able to get a couple more reps. But that's not the point. The work is maintaining the position, not just doing the movement.
And good technique will get you very far in everything. You know,
yeah.
I can't walk fast for long, but I was power walking, having not exercised. I just actually am coming off hernia surgery 2 months ago. So I did nothing for 6 weeks. And I started power walking at sub 12 minutes a mile.
Okay. That's fine to me.
I was like, wow, I'm like, that's cool. But, you know, I'm rotating my hips like a race walker and still have that flexibility and things like that. So why don't we open it up and see if people have some questions? Oh, go ahead.
You did ask me something I didn't address. I think it's probably important. It was something to the point of, was it the frequency of when? So, you know, obviously, a lot of this, I think, would be done physically, depending, like if you're a competitive athlete, you would have a tapering period leading up to your race where you're going to back out. You're going to bring the intensity up leading into that, but you have to offset fatigue. So that's its whole other thing. But in general, I would say for 2 to 3 times per week, if your focus is not strength training and it's trying to be supportive to your other activity, in this case, race walking, I think 2 sessions per week could be really productive. You would want to put those as far away from your other training session as possible. Like that would just be the very easy.
So on the easier days, not.
Yeah. And if that's, and if you're, and if you're training, if you actually are training every day, even during the day, trying to bring that session as further away from possible from that bout of that endurance exercise.
That's a great point. So I used to do my race walk and roll right into the gym and then lift weights. So you're suggesting do one in the morning, probably the race walk first, and then the weights, or vice versa?
I think you could do either. Part of me would almost say I would want to see the weight in the morning first. But yeah, in general, like the further you can space them, the better.
Okay.
But you know, the logistics of your personal schedule are going to dictate this, right? Like
we're all, time is your most valuable commodity. That doesn't matter what you're doing. That's always the issue. Yeah. Noel had a question for us.
Sure, unmute myself. Yeah, so I didn't want to interrupt, and if it's time for questions, I wanted to start off by saying how your description of doing the exercise or strength training with proper form really hits home. I'm dealing with a medial glute issue that my body was able to compensate for so long, especially as a runner.
Yeah.
But then when I switched to race walking, where it's more required, the weakness showed up. So it all makes very much sense. So a lot of the exercises I'm doing right now, it's exactly what you're talking about, where it's not about how many you can do, but it's about doing it and engaging the right muscles, getting them to fire.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, like you were talking about the older athletes, and I agree, I notice things now that I didn't before as things are getting weaker. My one question for you would be, from your experience, I'm a runner / race walker, most of it running, but more recently race walking. What would be some of the differences you've noticed from runners to race walkers? Because there's a slightly different sort of engagement of muscles. Is there anything unique to race walkers you've found?
Yeah, and I mean, I kind of mentioned this one briefly, and I'll be honest, I don't have the answer of what I don't want to use the word dysfunction is, but the struggle on hinge mechanics, particularly from a single leg aspect. And again, I don't know if that's like, hey, the adductors are like overly recruited. I don't have an answer for it. And it wasn't something that, again, for like from the time focus, it wasn't looked at as like, hey, we need to address and correct. It's we're going to work within the confines because this sport's providing this adaptation, if that makes sense. But like that was one that was like very evident to where to be able to do a single leg hinge and hold with a soft knee bend and keep that pelvis neutral was really challenging. And the only thing I can come up with is that rotational gait is just, again, so ingrained that it's pulling, again, whatever, again, quote, you
I
could
would
say
use the
over
word deficiency, maybe, a strength
well,
deficiency
or it could be, again, like it's efficient for what you guys are doing in your
Right.
sport, right? Just like the gymnast who's got forward rolled shoulders. It's like, well, I'm not going to work on like, oh, we got to get his shoulders back. Like, absolutely not, because that position's supporting his goals.
Mhm.
So again, that was a situation where, like, at first it's like, hey, do we need to do some correction on this? And then it was like, no, let's adapt that exercise. And again, it was small, gentle handholds to help keep them in a position where they're still getting the pelvis in a neutral position to get that like glute to fire through that movement, but just using a little bit of like little support. That was the big one that I did see.
No, thank you for that. It makes a lot of sense. And I think that's what I'm seeing myself. The body was just compensating. It was taking over, but now it's kind of said enough. So
Yeah,
thank you.
and so that like that level of like quote regression, if you will, I actually think that's a better route to go, because then you're in a better position to like drive and create like force. You can still slowly eccentric slow, so we can lower real slow, and then we can just still like come out of that movement powerfully, versus giving into the shift of posture.
Oh,
Great.
perfect. Thank you.
All right. Anybody else have a question?
Yeah, Jeff, if I may. I think you already asked most of the questions I had written down that I was going to ask tonight. One of the things that I've noticed, especially in longer races, full marathons, for example, is shoulder endurance, because race walking does use the arms so much. I noticed that a couple of the races I've done where I wasn't doing much upper body work, my shoulders fatigued quite a bit, and I had a hard time the last maybe 5-10K. When I was doing upper body work, then made a big difference. But you're talking lightweight versus heavyweight. For endurance, does it make a difference if you're using heavy weights or lighter weights?
Well, so again, I think that like that idea of endurance, like when you're talking on a marathon, right? Like there's no endurance load that's going to have a carryover to, again, mile 17, right? Like, so when I think of like an endurance load of like, hey, we're going to do 20 reps, like I would put that in an endurance load. I don't think there's going to be much carryover to that as far as like you not fatiguing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That's
Versus,
the biggest thing, is trying to stave off that fatigue as long as possible.
right.
In a long race.
I would think that there would be possibly some thoughts on efficiency through like some scapular stuff. So like that arm motion and that drive, and like doing some exercise, like some single, some opposite arm, and getting that scapula to maybe move better. I think there could be efficiencies there that could help, but I can't imagine that endurance, like from in the strength room, creating endurance in the traditional rep ranges, that's going to have that level of carryover. Like, I don't think it would be worth your time, versus again, when we can get down into more of like strength power loads and quote, build the bigger motor to then bring to the race, is going to have a bit more carryover.
Okay. Okay, good.
And
Thanks.
Gary, I could tell you firsthand, right? I mean, I was doing what you're saying, the endurance stuff, right? What I heard Luke say earlier was that doing it, quote, the right way or his way, you're going to get more bang for your buck. You're going to be more efficient in the time you spend in the weight room. Right. So, but if you do what we did, right, because I'm going to put myself in your category. And if I don't do any strength training, right, then I will feel that. And that was actually one of the things I felt in the power walk, is I haven't lifted any weights in a long time. And I'm trying to use my arms like a race walker as I power walk. And my arms were getting tired, even though I only went 2 or 3 miles, because I have no strength there. Right. So if I were doing 15 to 20 reps, will I feel better? Yes. Will I have more power? Yes. But if I follow what Luke is saying, will I have even more benefit? Right. So it's not about, is one good and one not good, but is one good and one better? Is that fair, Luke?
That makes sense.
And Gary, I think one thing I would say to you, particularly like when we're talking like the shoulders versus the legs in a race are obviously completely different experiences. So one thing I would consider if I was you, and that's like something noticeable that's happened, is I would get into like some good soft tissue specialist and just have them kind of like look at your gait and see if there's like, is there like restrictions to where, again, there's a lack of efficiency because things, I'm going to just say, aren't sliding and gliding, like that scapula doesn't move, or you don't have enough like thoracic rotation. Something that, and I think in some of the videos that we did, or from Jeff, forgive me, I can't exactly remember all of them, but like, I do think some rotational aspect would be really useful even for like race walkers. So this could be like ball throws against a wall, or like overhead with some rotational, ball throw work. Like that would have value as well, because there does need to be rotation in that spine. So in something in your case to where like you're feeling fatigued, that's where like, again, maybe that's getting into somebody and getting evaluated to where you might be missing some like rotation in the spine that's going up and like forcing you to have to do more through like some other shoulder movement that's creating fatigue. So like that's an inefficiency of movement. And again, that's where I would like try to get with like a hands-on practitioner and see if they can help you identify some of that. But that's where I would look.
Okay, great. Thanks.
And I remember back in the day when I would race walk and do a marathon, and I was like religious. My arm was roughly 90 degrees and it did not open and close during the stride. So all the work was, how relaxed is my shoulder? And, if it's relaxed, I'm not fatiguing my shoulder because it's rotating back and forth without a lot of resistance. But at the end of a 4 or 5 hour walk, if you've locked your arm like this and not changed that angle for 4 hours, when you went like this and you extended your arm, oh my God, my bicep would just like cringe, right? Because you don't realize you're using, your bicep just to hold your arm like that for 4 hours. So there's a lot of arm strength that's needed that people don't appreciate. All right, anybody got a question?
Yeah, I got just a couple questions. So actually commenting on the shortening of the bicep, I still don't have a full range of motion from all the years of race walking and arm curls. I still can't straighten this arm out. This one is even worse, but that's another story. But anyways, Luke, I'm a track and field coach and certified strength coach as well at Mansfield University here. I'm interested to hear a little more about the problem you saw with the hinge movement with RDLs.
State what an RDL is again for people.
Romanian deadlift.
I'm just kind of curious because I'm trying to visualize what you saw as a movement. So when you're doing the RDLs, you were doing them soft knee. Were they going to completely perpendicular T where the legs are out straight behind?
Yeah. So if I were to take either of those athletes, and so again, I'm using RDL, but I would actually have them go into a soft knee because I'm trying to like really get past hamstring and into hip.
Okay.
So if we should call that a traditional dead or a single leg dead, at that point, I'm semantics, I guess.
Right.
But I would say, so here's what we would see. So as we hinge and we're coming to perpendicular, their ability to hit there would be real tough like that hip would want to ride constantly. And so it's like, all right, what do we need to like foam roll and stretch to release to help you get to that position? At that point, that level of work it didn't feel productive because again, we're just trying to offset what I looked at as like so much stimulus with the race walking. Again, kind of like the bicep situation in yours.
Yeah.
Like there's just so much volume coming in for you when you're doing that much of that movement that like, you're kind of like the IT guy, right? I've worked with some guys that worked at computers and it's like, dude, their biceps are short. And we're sending them into like the massage therapist to get, bicep work done. And it's just from, coding all day. And like their arms don't extend anymore. So that was the big, like, yeah, it just, that hip would ride and their inability to like sit in the hip and get that glute to go at like a neutral pelvis was really tough.
Was this
Did you
Bulgarian
see-
split squat that you were teaching?
No, this would be a single leg RDL is what I would call it.
Okay.
And you haven't seen that in your distance runners as much?
I would see that in a lot of runners, but it was both with Miranda and Rachel. I remember that it was really evident, and that's a very common compensation. If you just took the average person and said, "Hey," and showed them try to do an RDL, the average person wants to go in this like crazy little adductor thing because there's just more stability there for them. They
Right.
feel more balanced. So the average person is going to struggle in that position. It was just the work to get them out of it seemed counterproductive based on, again, the stimulus coming in that was taking them there.
Okay.
I was trying to pull it up, but my Zoom.
And to give you, and Michael, for that, on that note, like, I'm not even saying that's 100% correct. Like, could there be ways to do like, hey, this is the specific soft tissue work that needs to be done? I've just had enough, and like, yeah, like that's actually like, she's really stable and looks really sound there.
Right.
This
Yeah.
this is what you're talking about, right?
Yeah. So that's yeah. And so like, yeah, Miranda's actually pulling that off really well. Whereas if for somebody else, it's like, oh man, if like your arch is collapsing or like that hip's hiking, it's like, well, let's just bring in some little bit of, this is filmed better than my tutorial videos that I'm using now for my clients. Yeah. So like, she's actually quite stable there.
Yeah.
And I think little things like that, I think also have value, I think, is playing with like footwear. Obviously, like you guys are putting mileage in, and I don't think it would be a bad idea to do some barefoot work again in these same basic movement patterns. Like to me, I call this a basic movement pattern, meaning that's like a hip hinge is like how you bend over to pick up your groceries, right? Now,
Right.
so obviously done on a single leg is getting much more like, quote, sport specific, because obviously in running, you're on your one leg at a time. But like, to me, that's something I feel like even your average hiker or like my mom, it's like, hey, this is what I want you to do to like age well, is be able to go into a hinge pattern productively.
Yeah. Gary was talking about the fatigue in the shoulders. So a little bit of research going back, Tudor Bompa, who, if you're, wrote Periodization of Strength Training. Some of the early researchers did some experimentation with extreme high reps. And they came out with 3 basic results. And this is, by the way, when we're talking high reps, like people talk about high reps of 20, these guys are talking about 100.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Continuous movement. You've seen this work before,
Yeah. I mean, this is like boxers doing, yeah.
Yeah. And what the end result is, you end up with forced mitochondrial replication. You end up with high degrees of local muscle endurance. And you end up with thickening of the actin and myosin filaments without actually a lot of hypertrophy.
Sure.
I think you're right about the movement being restricted, and that's why the fatigue comes. It's more than likely. But that could be an answer for, an athlete. And isolation exercises really decoordinate athletes, and race walking is too whole body to really do a lot of isolation, but it might, in a therapeutic sense, help if there's not a restriction, or, so that might be something to look at. Although when you said shoulders, I'm not sure where he was exactly talking about. That
Right. Like if he's getting like local deltoid burn.
Yeah.
So,
That's exactly what I was talking about, Michael. After X number of miles of, the arm motion for us race walkers, my deltoids especially, we're just getting tired. And then your form breaks down and things kind of go to heck after that.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, so that'd be something to look into. To like you're saying. I mean, again, I think of that like a boxer. Like if you haven't done a boxing class and you realize like, wow, after 3 minutes, you couldn't hold your arms up anymore, and then you watch a fight and you're like, these guys can punch, thousands of times, and so there's obviously going to be that adaptation for sure.
yeah, I was training at about the same time that Jeff was, and so I was full of doing stupid things, and
Well, we did what we thought was right at the time.
right. Although, doing 100 deltoid arm raises with 5 pounds really did help reduce the stress on the shoulders, to be honest with you.
Oh yeah, I see that.
Yes, so it was,
Look,
yeah,
I
it took a long time.
People in our generation that strength trained, regardless of if we did one mechanism or the other, had a huge advantage over people who did not.
Yeah, and I would actually agree with that. Like on the, again, like older population. I have a dad who's 67, complete back's jacked, knees are jacked, he's a mess, right? And it's like, hey, that same rule is going to apply for him, to where it's like, you are going to be better off if you have some strength to back up your movement. How we get him into that strength, it's like, at this point, it's like, we'll take what we can get. And so for him, it's like, hey, I don't love a leg extension at all, or like but like, what if that's productive for him? It's like, I would rather him do that than not. Obviously, I'm always trying to get it back to these more, what I'm going to say, like lifestyle movement based mechanics that like have some application. But I would still rather be a segmented, strong older person than a weak version of that, if that makes sense.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
All right.
When you're working with your clients, are you working to try to deliberately manipulate the hormonal cycles with the weights and intensities? Are you working at that level at all?
No. And again, with what I'm doing now, so like this is hopefully came through in the beginning. I'm not involved with endurance athletes at this point. I'm working with, like, to give you, like, here's a guy that I just finished with. He's 40 pounds overweight, runs 3 companies, drinks a bottle of tequila to get through it. Liver enzymes are up. A handle of vodka a week to deal with it. Liver enzymes are through the roof. And it's like, this is a restoration process of his health and his fitness. And now he's down to 200 pounds and we've curbed that. So it's bringing in more lifestyle structure, general strength habits. And yeah, so that's where the work that I'm involved in today. So again, there's probably other applications for race walk stuff that I have absolutely no idea of, but this is what I can tell you that I was using at the time.
Oh, well, that makes sense. Okay.
Great. All right. Well, Luke, thanks for your time tonight. And like I said, I will link in the exercises that we were talking about. And there's also a background that's at a more basic level to some of the stuff that you said, that we, give an intro into why we're doing strength training the way we do. So appreciate your time. Appreciate everybody who had questions or who are just part of the audience. And I will record this and post it tomorrow. So thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Jeff, good seeing you.
You too.
Thank you.